Afghanistan's human stories reflect the long gaze of history. It's often said the country's been a graveyard of empires and the cockpit of a great game between competing superpowers. In the 19th century, it was Britain protecting her empire. In the 20th century, the Soviets defending a client state. In the 21st, America punishing terrorism. And already the departure of Western forces has some wondering which country will insert itself into the next chapter of Afghanistan's story. Will it be Pakistan, Iran, or even China? When you look at a map of Afghanistan, you can see why they say geography is more important than history. Afghanistan is girdled to the south and east by its more populous neighbour Pakistan. The Taliban are mostly ethnic Pashtun, as are 20 million Pakistanis. To the west sits Iran, the Shia superpower. Iran keeps a watchful eye over the Hazaras, the Persian-speaking Shiites, who form Afghanistan's third largest ethnic group. They've been persecuted for their faith for centuries. To the north are the Central Asian and former Soviet republics, a reminder of how Moscow was drawn into Afghanistan with such far-reaching and empire-ending consequences. And then tucked away to the northeast, a tiny 50-mile-wide border with China. How important might that be if, as predicted, China is preparing to exploit the huge copper deposits near Kabul? So that's the geography. What about the history? Professor Robert Toombs of St John's College, Cambridge, is one of Britain's best-known historians. He joins me now. Professor, thanks so much for your time. For a country which, by many measures, doesn't have a lot going for it in terms of resources, it's been the cockpit of a great many nations fighting over it.
It has, and it's partly because it's such a difficult country to control. And empires tend to want to make their borders safe. That's often their main priority. And Afghanistan has always been a pretty uncontrollable area. I've never been there, but I've flown over it. And, you only have to see the country itself to realise how almost impossible it is to dominate. We tried, as you said, in the 19th century. We lost one war disastrously, won another one. Third one was a sort of draw. But I think the difference is that Britain's ambitions were always pretty limited. It's cynical, but it was to keep the Afghans from causing trouble, not trying to make them into something they weren't. What empires classically do and where they go wrong is often when they're trying to do too much. We went into Afghanistan, of course, as everyone knows, to try to stop it being used by terrorists, and then we tried to do a lot more. I mean, it was idealistic, it was principled, but it turned out to be just too much. And where empires go wrong is when they find that they're overstretched and they can't actually carry out the things that they wanted to do. And then you get a loss of credibility, a loss of self-confidence, and the sort of disaster that the Americans have now suffered, and which we suffered even worse in 1842, when a whole British and Indian army was wiped out.
And just a solitary doctor on horseback was allowed to ride away and tell the story of ignominy,
yes.
Wasn't he? We focused there on the Americans and the British. What about the Soviets? You talked about being overstretched. Well, there's the classic story of overstretched. The Soviets were so overstretched, what happened to them in Afghanistan, perhaps, in the minds of many, precipitated the unravelling of the Soviet Union.
Yes, I'm sure it did. That was part of it anyway, a major part. Empires are based, I think, always probably to a large extent on bluff, on the feeling that they're invincible and that if you're sensible, you accept your role as subordinate. Once empires start being beaten, and once even something as apparently powerful as the Soviet Union was shown to be powerless in Afghanistan, then, as you say, the whole thing starts unraveling. The same thing was happening at the other end of the Soviet Empire in Poland. And when you can no longer enforce your will, then the empire is effectively on the way to extinction.
I've read this morning that one of the reasons Joe Biden appeared to be so phlegmatic about what's happening in Afghanistan is because his mind, the Pentagon's mind, is focused elsewhere now. It's wargaming a situation 10, 20 years hence with China. And in that sense, Afghanistan, not quite an irrelevance, but less important than it was. Talk to us about China and potentially its imperial ambitions.
Well, let's hope that somebody knows what they're doing and that they have, in fact, been thinking ahead, because the impression one gets is of an absence of thought. Well, China, of course, is an empire too, but it's a very different kind of empire. It's, I suppose, the world's oldest empire. And it's, I was thinking earlier, some empires are like tortoises, and some empires are like octopuses. Ours and perhaps the American have been rather like octopuses. We've been extending our tentacles into all sorts of places. The Chinese is one big solid mass, and those sorts of empires tend to last a long time. But what they're often not very good at doing is extending. We remember when the Chinese took over Tibet, it caused them endless troubles. Of course, it caused the Tibetans far more. If the Chinese try to insert their power directly into Afghanistan, I'm sure that they will meet the same kinds of problems and face the same kind of defeats that the Russians and the Americans and indeed ourselves have faced in the past.
Work for future historians like you. Professor Robert Toombs, appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Afghanistan, then. A human story like no other. Its latest twist has an impact way beyond its dusty borders. In parts of the Islamic world, there is quiet rejoicing at the victory of a Muslim army. In the US, the Biden presidency may never recover from the scenes of chaos at Kabul airport. Here in the UK, it's prompted soul-searching about the price Britain pays for the special relationship. We went to war in Afghanistan to support an ally, and we couldn't linger once that ally had decided it had been there long enough. Well, for our veterans, especially those who returned with missing limbs and tortured minds, there is a mix of emotions. Pride at having done the best job they could, futility that its fruits have been squandered. For the Afghan women whose country is such a mix of biblical beauty and ugly savagery, there is the return of the burqa, the return of beatings for women caught outside without a man to watch over them, the return of stonings for women who young men have decided are adulterers. And for people like me who saw the Taliban fall the first time, there is a thought, a wishful one perhaps, that history might yet, perhaps, repeat itself. Whilst there is resistance in the Panjshir Valley, the only one of Afghanistan's 34 districts not yet fully under the iron grip of Taliban control, there is potentially at least a glimmer of hope for those who do not want to turn the clock back in Afghanistan for at least 1,000 years. You've been watching Afghanistan, the human story.